So you might have seen this picture floating around recently on the internet in like the iceberg community, but it seems like most people who are looking at it don't really understand everything that's going on here. So as an expert in the field, I thought I'd like to explain what's going on for the benefit of everyone. So at the top here we have global warming, which is essentially the idea that the Earth is heating up and this is causing all of the icebergs to melt. And there's a little bit of controversy over this, but it seems that most people are sort of coming around to the truth that it's actually there and it's not just some crazy conspiracy. After that, we have, of course, iceberg horoscopes, which is the idea that you can predict the future by looking at the way icebergs crash together in the spring. It's common in sort of northern Canada, like Inuits and stuff. They've been doing it for a long time, and it's been good for them. So, but yeah, this isn't quite as mainstream, but it's reasonably well known. It's just not very widely accepted. Next, you have Saturn's rings, which are made of ice, but some people kind of dispute this, and mostly they just do this for political agendas, trying to and like legal reasons for like, oh, if it's not made of ice, then maybe we can colonize it for our countries and our own agendas and stuff. But science is pretty clear that they are made of ice. After this, Iceland. Most people think that Iceland is actually covered in ice, and in fact, this is what the Vikings called it. Like the Vikings called it Iceland, so then everyone would think it was cold and they wouldn't invade them, and it's worked out well for them. I don't believe Iceland's been invaded in several hundred years. Anyway, moving on, we have comets, which are also commonly believed to be like icebergs, but they're actually not, because comets have rock in the middle, and if you were to put a comet in the ocean, it would sink because it's too dense, which means it's not an iceberg because it's heavier than water. Okay, moving on down a bit, we have some of the slightly more obscure theories, but they're still reasonably well-founded and explainable. It's just that for some reason or another they're not accepted by the mainstream. So, for example, 90% of an iceberg is actually below the surface. There'll be a picture coming on screen right about now showing that. But so at the top, you can see some of the iceberg, and for a long time this was, we thought that was all there was to it, or maybe it was about half and half. But it turns out that they're actually huge underneath the water. Next is the Russian ice smuggling. You might think this is some Soviet thing, the USSR, but it's actually still ongoing today, and we expect it to keep going on up until around the 2040s, just as Putin really tries to push it. But essentially the idea is that you smuggle, drugs and large shipping containers and that sort of thing within icebergs, so that way they can avoid, heat, imaging scanners and that sort of thing. And you can smuggle basically whatever you want. You can smuggle rather large containers without anyone noticing anywhere that's cold enough for the iceberg to look inconspicuous. Also, it's ghost icebergs, which is icebergs that they're sort of, you can go through them and it's difficult to interact with them. I believe rabbits can interact with them, but not much else can. Like sound even goes through them and that sort of thing. But light doesn't go through them. That's it. Next, the mirror people, which were a separate species of people that were believed to exist, or at least they were sighted a long time ago. But essentially, sailors would look into the iceberg and they would see like separate people instead of their own reflections, if that makes sense. So This hasn't been reported since the 18th century. It was the last one, except actually there was another one in the 20th century, like 1950s, but that one doesn't really count. It's not really reputable. Yeah. Next, there's Tierra del Fuego and the incidents surrounding that, where essentially the Chilean government dumped a lot of strange waste in the Pacific Ocean. And essentially, pink icebergs started washing up on the coast of Tierra del Fuego. And today, these are people think these are just like natural things, and that's what the government's trying to tell you. But it's not actually true. It was actually due to a bunch of just waste that went into the sea and then came back. This is actually the reason El Nino has been getting worse in the last few decades. It's actually separate to global warming. Finally, we have iceberg melt not changing sea level, since icebergs are made out of water already, so the sea level wouldn't actually rise when they melt, as opposed to glacial melt, where if a glacier would melt, then the water would go into the sea. You would think this would be just standard science by now, but there's actually a bit of a debate, since icebergs are, like a lot of people are saying, icebergs are more dense than the water, so there's more water in the iceberg than outside of it, which would mean that when it melted, there would be more volume, so the sea level would rise. But if it's so dense, why doesn't it sink? Moving on to the next sort of layer down. So this layer has it's some more controversial ideas, but you might have at least heard of some of them. It's also where we start getting into some of the more verifiably supernatural theories on the list. So firstly, the iceless Arctic. There's this idea that perhaps in 9 or 10 years, you'll be able to look at the Arctic from space and just not see any ice, just see blueness, like a complete lack of icebergs. This probably won't have any implications for anything else, though, so it's not very important. Next, there's the Titanic inside job, where you see it's well established that the Titanic crashed into a large steamship in the North Atlantic Ocean and sunk tragically, as did the steamship actually. But most people will tell you that the steamship is actually just a natural steamship, broke off from the Arctic and just floated south. But that's not how steamships come into being. Everyone knows this. It was actually put there by the British. This ship, known as the White Star, actually set sail from Southampton a few days beforehand, and then just deliberately went right into the Titanic and sunk it. And then the government, the United Kingdom and the United States just cooperated and covered it all up and just made it seem like a terrible accident, when really it was the fault of the British. Of course, we can't talk about conspiracy theories without talking about the Antarctic conjuration rituals, which were some rituals done by a private company from New Zealand called RIME, which were supposedly marine biologists. But if you want my opinion, I would say they were most likely occultists. Next, we have the Zapotec colony, which is an interesting settlement that was found actually on the underside of a large iceberg in the late 20th century, during the 80s. Some divers discovered some stone and brick, like clay brick temples and houses literally on the bottom of a large iceberg, which were actually discovered to have come from central Mexico, bizarrely. And after actually yeah, so they weren't able to find much more after that. But then a few years ago, actually, an archaeological dig in Mexico discovered some drawings and plans for this city. Um, in the end, not the whole city wasn't built; it was just a small area. But essentially, an iceberg washed up on the shore of Mexico, and then there's a Potex put the built houses and stuff on the iceberg, and then tried to send the iceberg off to sea as like a warship, but it's actually toppled upside down, and now 90% of that iceberg is actually above the water, like a mountain. Also, we have to talk about iceberg personality tests, which is the idea that you can find out some stuff about what a person is like, sort of psychologically, from the way that the icebergs crash together in the spring. Um, I don't really put a lot of stock in it, but some people swear by it. You're getting to the sort of abyssal kind of area of theories that definitely they don't have much traction in everyday society at all, but there are various reasons why people could believe them. And you know, shouldn't really write them off just because they sound strange. Um, so firstly, the deep Kola borehole. So the Kola borehole was a Soviet project thing where they dug a tunnel and supposedly they'd found hell within it. But what many people don't know is this actually goes deeper than that, right through to the other side of the world, emerging in the South Pacific, um, essentially as travel, but also for communications with, some kind of, like, I wouldn't really say it's hell, but hell's probably inspired by it. Um, we should also talk about the hovering icebergs, which were actually discovered in 1999 by a kayaker around Svalbard, who discovered just a colossal rectangular iceberg that, for some reason, was hovering 3 centimeters above the actual water. And he took photographs of its underside, actually. So it's kind of undisputable if you look at the evidence that they were actually hovering. Um, but for some reason, every government in the world has just covered it up, and they won't acknowledge this evidence. Um, so the hovering iceberg hasn't been seen since, but we're kind of looking for it. It's I think it's important that we find the hovering iceberg sometime because there's definitely something inside of it or something that it is. Um, Saturnian nuclear war is another idea where essentially Saturn's rings. It's the public belief is that they were just made by like two, like a moon or something, breaking apart. But I don't know. Moons don't go around the whole planet, so it sounds a bit weird. So what's more likely is that there were two species, one made from rocks and the other one made from ice. Then using the what's it called? Some nuclear material found in Saturn's moons. They created nuclear weapons, and due to racial tensions, the weapons were eventually used against each other. Um, but unfortunately, the combination of nuclear weapons and hand-to-hand combat turned out to be tactically poor, so they were all destroyed and don't exist anymore. Of course, we have to talk about the Syrian Iron Temple, which was built in the 31st century BC, shortly after an iceberg actually materialized in what's today northeastern Syria, which is strange given that icebergs aren't normally found in that kind of area. Um, and we can't really figure out why it was there, but there's actually evidence in the soil to this day that it was there. And we can also see the temple that they built because of the iceberg. And they sort of write about how the iceberg maybe told them to do it, or we think what happened was they found a plant which, when smoked, sort of gives like hallucinations, but hallucinations of the future and like premonitions and that sort of thing. It's because the temple actually has drawings of things that they couldn't possibly have known about. This last one is probably the most controversial of all of them. You might be thinking to yourself right now that, you know, icebergs aren't rocks. That's ridiculous. They're all made of frozen water. But think to yourself, when have you ever seen that much ice freeze all in one place? Like, you just haven't, because it's not possible. Like, micro icebergs can be created after not that long by just water at a cold temperature. But the amount of time that would be required for a macro iceberg to all join together, like, there just isn't that much time. So you can see from that that obviously icebergs can't be made of frozen water, and honestly, it makes a lot of sense that they're rocks. They were just put out from the ocean floor by undersea volcanoes, essentially. So yeah, that concludes the explanation. This should really show you that what you see of icebergs is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all the things that there are to know about it. If you like the video or you have any questions, then die.